Howdy. Welcome to Howdies. You know, back in college, I was part of a country and western dance group called the Aggie Wranglers. I was actually a much better dancer than I am woodworker, but that's another point. Fast forward 25 years and my oldest son and his partner just made the exact same team. I decided to make them both a custom Bootjack to celebrate. Hope you enjoy the build. To start, I selected the woods and colors I wanted to use. I found some really nice bubinga with a reddish, well, Aggies would call that maroon, tone for the center, and used some nice figured ash for the outsides. Since this was going to be a custom job, I wanted to insert the Aggie Wrangler logo as well as their names inlaid into the middle of the Bootjack, where the bubinga would be. For the inlaid logo and letters, I wanted to use some really nice maple burl I purchased off eBay. I first cut the maple burl into small, thin layers, roughly 1/4 of an inch. This will be used with my CNC to route out the letters and the logos for the inlays. I then cut a strip of bubinga about 1.5 inches. This will be the center strip of the Bootjacks. And I cut the ash into 2 1.5-inch strips for the outsides. To add a little distinction between the ash and the bubinga, I decided to cut some small, thin strips of wingy on the table saw. I then used my bandsaw to cut the wingy down closer to the final thickness that I wanted, roughly 1/8 of an inch. I used the drum sander to finalize the thickness of the wingy highlight strips and to assure the edges were flat and ready for glue up. Once all 3 types of wood were cut to their final thickness, I cut them to their working length of 13 inches and readied them for glue up. One trick I used was to clamp all the same width pieces, in this case the bubinga and the ash, together and run it through the drum sander. This assures that the edges are all flat, level, and ready for final glue up. Just make sure that your clamps do not hit the drum when they go through. I laid out my pattern for the glue up, the ash, the wingy, the bubinga, the wingy, and then the ash, and I laid them out on my pipe clamps. Note, always lay the pieces out first so that you can select the best color and grain patterns. As you can see here, I tried to mirror the ash grain on the outside so it matched. I added a lot of glue and used 2 pipe clamps on the outside, and after putting some tape in the middle to protect my clamp, I added a 3rd clamp in the middle. This middle clamp will keep the pieces flat and assure that the middle is securely glued as well. While the glue was drying, I turned my attention to the inlay letters and logos. Using easel and my CNC, I laid out the logo and the letters to be inlaid. Note that I messed up here. I used a very angled bit with the idea that the letters would fit securely into the rounded out holes, but I did not inverse the letters. I should have inverted the letters so that the wider part of the inserted letter would be at the top, the outside, and the narrower part of the letter would be towards the bottom, the inside. Oops. Oh well, you'll see how I fix that later, and I actually think it came out better. Happy mistakes. Once the glue was dried, I ran the pieces through the drum sander again to assure the top and the bottom were flat. I then used my CNC and easel to cut the inserts from the center bubinga. Note, take your time setting this up. As you can see, I was not perfectly centered on my logo, so it was a little bit offset. Also, I had to make sure not to do the inserts too far away from the top, or I would not have room to cut the heel insert at the top of the Bootjack. I test fit the letter and the logo inserts into the cutouts, and then used my table saw to square up the top and bottom of the Bootjack. Although not required, most Bootjacks are tapered towards the top, so I use my table saw to cut angles for the Bootjack bodies. Note that once you cut the first angle, you can use that off-cut piece to align for the cut for the second side to assure they are the same angles. Using my bandsaw, I cut out the heel notches, again making sure there was plenty of space between the end of the heel notch and the start of my inlays. As you'll see later, this space is needed since I added leather to the heel notch. For the inserts, I mixed up a batch of black epoxy and put that into the cut slots before inserting the logos and the letters. Note that before you use black or other dark colored epoxy on bare wood, it's good to spray the wood with a layer of shellac. This keeps the dark epoxy from seeping in and staining the wood where it touches. I inserted the inserts into the gaps and clamped them down so that they would be fully inserted and secure into the slots. Once the epoxy was dry, I used my edge sander to make sure the edges of the Bootjack were sanded smooth. I then used my drum sander again to flatten the inserts and clean up the epoxy from the inserted names and logo. Here I encountered two problems. First, the drum sander was burning the ash. This likely occurred due to my trying to take too much wood off with each pass. The second problem was that the epoxy did not fully fill in the gaps around the letters, so I had some low spots. To fix this, I sanded a piece of excess wingy to get some dust, and I put that dust into the gaps. I then added some CA glue to the top and used an accelerator for quicker drying. Then I sanded it flat again. Using my router table and an 1/8 inch router roundover bit, I rounded out the edges of the top and the bottom of each of the Bootjacks so they would be smooth. Remember to always move your piece against the spin of the blade and keep your fingers away from the bit at all times. Although I tried to do that here, I still used my bare hands. I probably could have used some push blocks to make sure that my fingers were even further away from the spinning bit and were safely away from getting damaged. I sanded the final pieces up to 400 grit and then turned my attention to the bottom stand piece for the Bootjacks. For these, I cut out a square piece of ash just under the total width of the Bootjacks, and I sanded out an angle on the bottom so that once it was attached, the Bootjacks would sit level and not wobble. I clamped the bottom bases onto the jack and drilled countersunk screw holes so the screws would not scratch against any flooring. I then glued the bottom bases on using wood glue and added the wood screws to keep it attached securely. Using mineral spirits, I cleaned up the pieces and added my branded logo to the bottoms. I've learned that spraying water onto the wood before you brand it keeps the brand from burning too much of the wood and from burning it inconsistently. Unfortunately, spraying water doesn't keep me from branding it off-center. Dang it. I finished the wood with a number of coats of True Oil, which really made the grains in the wood come alive. As a newbie woodworker, I still have to learn better finishing, and most importantly, not to rush the finishing process. I really like the True Oil and the way it looks, but probably should have done some additional layers. The final part was to cut some strips of leather for the heel notch. I used some tacks I found off Amazon to secure the leather to the Bootjack, but I found I had to pre-drill the holes since the leather was too thick and the wood was too hard for the jacks to simply be hammered in. Here's the final pieces. My oldest son and his partner really liked them, and I, as always, learned some great lessons in the build. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. Hope to see you again soon.